There are women who arrive in a man's life not with thunder, but with quiet hands and soft-spoken kindness. Edith didn't come for love. She came to cook for his dying mother, to earn a corner of peace in a world that had given her very little. But in the silence of her footsteps, in the scent of rosemary in his kitchen, in the way she folded his mother's blankets at dusk, Reuben Maddox began to feel something he never expected to feel again. Not longing, but home. But here's what folks don't talk about out west. They don't talk about what happens when a widower swears off love and then finds it stitched into the seams of an apron. They don't talk about the moment a child not his own calls her mama without thinking, and how that word lodges in his throat for the rest of the day. And they certainly don't talk about how love can grow in a house full of grief, not like a wildfire, but like a vine climbing slowly toward sunlight. She never asked for more, but the ache in her chest each time he turned away, that was real. He never meant to fall. But the scent of warm biscuits and the sound of her laugh in the next room, it started to feel like mercy. Missed moment, plus emotional ignition, plus curiosity. So when she wore that cream dress on Sunday and the whole town turned to whisper, when he walked across the room, heart pounding like a man at war with himself, did he defend her? Did he choose her? Did he finally say the words he'd bitten back for months? Because this story isn't about cooking, it's about the kind of woman a man never thought he deserved and what happens when he realizes he does. Stay with us, because the quietest love stories, they're often the ones that save us in the end. Would you have stayed if you were her? Would you have stepped forward if you were him? Tap play. Let's find out what happened next. Together. The wagon wheels moaned as they turned down the dusty road to the Maddox Ranch. It was early autumn, and the prairie was gold and gray sunlight leaking through thin clouds as if heaven itself had grown tired. The kind of afternoon where the silence felt thick, like the land was holding its breath. Edith May Tollin sat straight-backed on the buckboard, hands folded in her lap over patched gloves. She wore a plain gray dress not because it was all she owned, but because color felt too loud for a woman like her. 53 years old, widowed, once loved, once left. Her back was still straight, her speech still careful. Dignity, she had learned, didn't cost a thing, only everything else. Next to her sat the driver, a freckled farm boy who hadn't spoken more than 2 words since she'd climbed aboard. That suited Edith fine. She wasn't much for idle talk anymore. The journey had been paid for by the man who needed a cook. Nothing more, nothing less. And she had told herself over and over that it was better this way. The ranch came into view just past a stand of windblown cottonwoods. Fences leaned like tired shoulders. The main house stood with a kind of defiant tiredness, its porch sagging roof patched with mismatched shingles. It was not a home built for comfort. It was a place where people endured. He came out as the wagon slowed. Reuben Maddox, the widower. His arms were crossed, boots planted wide in the dust. A tall man, maybe late 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd fought land and grief both and lost more than he said. He didn't offer a smile. Only said, "You're here." Edith nodded. "Yes, sir, I am." He stepped closer, glanced at her single trunk, then back to her face. "You'll be cooking for my mother, not me. Just so we're clear." "I understand," she said. Her voice was quiet but even. No confusion about that. None. He turned to the boy. "Unload her trunk by the back door. She sleeps in the pantry loft." Then he looked back at her. "You're not here to talk. You're not here to fix anything. You're here to feed my mother 3 times a day and keep the fire lit. That's the job." Edith didn't flinch. "That's what I'll do." And with that, he walked away. The pantry loft was a narrow crawl of space above dry goods and winter jars. The ceiling pitched low, and the only window faced north onto bare trees and wind. But it was clean, and someone, she guessed the mother, had placed a folded quilt at the end of the cot. Blue stitching on white, daffodils, a soft defiance. That night she cooked chicken broth with root vegetables and warm cornbread. Not out of kindness, but because the old woman, Mrs. Maddox, he had said not mother, deserved a meal that felt like something other than waiting. When she brought it in, the woman was propped against 2 pillows, eyes sharp, despite the sag of age. "You're the cook, then," the old woman said. "I am. What's your name?" "Edith May Tolland." A pause. You look tired, Edith May. I carry my years with me, ma'am. As we all do. The old woman gave a dry chuckle. At least you carry them standing. That was the closest to welcome she would receive. Later that evening, alone in the loft, Edith lit a small candle and sat by the window. The wind had picked up, and somewhere out there a coyote called. She didn't cry. She hadn't in years. But her fingers lingered over the stitches of that daffodil quilt longer than they needed to. She had been many things in her life: daughter, wife, mother, widow. She had been touched without kindness and spoken to without care. But she had not lost herself. And if all she was now was a cook in a stranger's house, then so be it. She would do it with care, with hands that still remembered gentleness, even if they were seldom touched by it in return. Downstairs, the wood stove clicked as it cooled. Somewhere the old woman was breathing, and Reuben Maddox, hard-eyed grieving, was likely sitting alone with his silence. And upstairs in a narrow loft that held more wind than warmth, Edith May Tollin began again. She came only to serve. But the land like hearts holds more than it shows at first glance. The next morning brought with it a hard frost. Ice glistened along the porch rail, like old lace, fragile and sharp. Edith May Tollin rose early, habit not duty, and made the kitchen hers by instinct, not instruction. The iron skillet was already seasoned well, and the flour barrel half full. She washed her hands in cold water, tied her apron, and began with biscuits. By the time the house creaked awake, the smell of butter and wood smoke filled the low-ceilinged rooms. She made oatmeal with stewed apple, and Cinnamon carried it to Mrs. Maddox and set the tray gently on the bedside table. "You don't say good morning?" the old woman asked, one eye squinted. Edith smiled faintly. "Didn't want to startle you, ma'am." "Startled me by not saying it. You've been around widows before, haven't you?" "I've been one myself for near 14 years. A pause. "Then you understand the quiet." Edith nodded. "And the ache that comes before dawn." The old woman picked up the spoon. "Well, at least the food's warm." Downstairs, Reuben Maddox stood at the sink, scrubbing yesterday's mud from his boots. He heard the clink of dishes, smelled the breakfast, and frowned. Not because it smelled bad, because it smelled like something lost. He had grown used to quiet, to the way a house echoes when no one speaks. And now there was humming, soft, steady, coming from the pantry loft. A hymn maybe, or a lullaby for no one. "Do you hum because you're nervous?" he asked at noon, when she handed him a plate of salt pork and beans. Edith didn't flinch. "I hum because it fills the corners." He didn't answer, just took the plate and walked out onto the porch without looking at her again. By the third day, the house began to breathe differently. The woodpile was stacked neat. The pantry shelves labeled in looping cursive. A bundle of lavender hung by the back window, its scent softening the hard edges of the kitchen. Edith hadn't asked permission for any of it. She simply moved as if the house needed order, and she knew how to give it. And though Reuben Maddox said little, he didn't stop her either. One afternoon, she found an old photograph tucked in a drawer. A woman with a round face, laughing eyes, and her hand resting on Reuben's shoulder. His late wife, no doubt. The picture was creased at the edges, worn soft from being touched. Edith didn't linger. She closed the drawer, her fingers, pausing just a moment too long before stepping away. That night, she brought Mrs. Maddox a new quilt, stitched from old clothes she'd found in a trunk. Bits of flannel and faded muslin sewn into stars. "I don't need pity," the old woman said, blinking. "It's not pity," Edith replied gently. "It's just fabric with a memory." A silence, then a sigh. "You got a strange way about you." "I've been told that before." The next morning, as she set a tray down with boiled eggs and toast, Mrs. Maddox asked without looking up, "You ever been loved the right way, Edith May?" It hit her in the gut like a dropped skillet. Still, her voice was steady. "Once. Briefly. He died in a spring flood near Elk Ridge. He loved you well. Well enough to leave me better than he found me." The old woman nodded, eyes fixed on the distance. Only the dying seemed to see. "Then you know more than my son." Outside, Reuben stood at the barn gate watching the horses. His mother's words had stayed in his ears longer than they should have. She hadn't meant him to hear, but he had. That night when he passed Edith in the hallway, he didn't look away. He said the quilt was nice. Edith blinked. "Thank you." He paused. "My mother don't warm to folks easy. I'm not here for warmth." He gave a half nod. "Still, I noticed." He walked on. But behind him, Edith's hands trembled slightly, whether from hope or fear, she wasn't sure. And so it began, not love, not yet, but a soft shifting of the ground beneath them, like two people hearing the same distant song and not yet knowing they were humming along. He began to notice the quiet things she fixed, but not the one thing mending within him. The wind that week turned mean. It howled down the chimney and slipped under doors like an unwelcome ghost. Edith May Tollin worked with sleeves rolled, hands chapped red from scrubbing. The old pump creaked each time she filled her basin, and she wore the same threadbare shawl day after day without complaint. But Reuben Maddox had noticed something he couldn't unnotice: the way Edith had become part of the rhythm of the ranch. Not loud, not soft, just steady. The kind of presence that felt like it had always been there, and it scared him. One evening after a long day mending fence, Reuben returned to find his boots cleaned and placed near the hearth. His coat hung neatly beside them, mended at the cuff. He turned jaw tight. "You're not a maid." Edith, kneeling by the stove, looked up calmly. "Never claimed to be." "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," she said gently. "You didn't." The silence that followed was full of unsaid things: regret, fear, resentment that had no real place but needed somewhere to land. The next morning, Mrs. Maddox was in one of her difficult moods. "Girl," she snapped as Edith changed her linens, "don't start thinking this house is yours." "I don't," Edith answered, smoothing the blanket, "but I treat it kindly." "Hm." The old woman squinted. "You're the kind who looks for meaning in chores, aren't you? I've had worse things to look for." The old woman stared a moment, then turned her face to the wall. At the general store later that week, the whispers began again. "She's still there, cooking for them like some kind of wife. Maybe she's after the will. No ring, just pride and pie crusts." Edith heard it all. She bought flower candles and ribbon for Mrs. Maddox's hair, paid with coins Reuben had left on the table without a word. As she stepped outside, she caught sight of Reuben across the street, hands in pockets, watching. She paused. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just turned and walked away. That night dinner was quiet. No words, just spoon against bowl fire crackling. Lana, one of the ranch hand's daughters who sometimes visited, had drawn a picture of Edith with flowers in her hair. She'd left it on the table beside Reuben's plate. He picked it up, glanced at it, then tucked it under his napkin, like it meant nothing. Edith cleared the plates in silence. She didn't cry that night. She just sat by the basin, washing dishes until the water turned cold. But it all came to a head 3 days later, after a storm blew down part of the barn roof. Edith, apron soaked, climbed the ladder to help. She held the nails steady while Reuben hammered. "You don't have to prove anything," he said, suddenly not meeting her eyes. "I'm not," she replied, "just helping." "You do too much. I've always done too much. That's what happens when you've been left behind." His head jerked up. "I didn't ask you to stay." Her voice was soft, but it held a weight he couldn't look away from. "I know, but I did. And you haven't asked me to leave either." That silence between them was the loudest thing all day. That evening when she brought him tea, Reuben didn't touch it. "You're not family," he said low. "You're just here to cook for my mother." Edith nodded, lips pressed tight. She turned to go, but at the door she paused. "I was never here to ask for anything, Mr. Maddox, only to serve where I was needed. But maybe I hoped, foolishly, to be seen." She left the tea untouched, and Reuben, for the first time in years, felt the sting of shame burn deeper than any prairie sun. He didn't see her the next morning, or the next. The house was clean, meals cooked. But Edith moved like a ghost there, but not. She no longer met his eye, no longer lingered at the stove when he entered the kitchen. She folded in on herself like a letter no longer meant to be read. Outside, the prairie bloomed in late spring colors. But inside the Maddox house, two people stood at a quiet war with past wounds, with fear, and with the stubborn ache of wanting something they believed they no longer deserved. She had offered him kindness, and he had mistaken it for burden. But some wounds don't bleed, they wait to be named. It began with the teacup, the one Edith always placed at Reuben's spot, white china cracked at the rim, but warm with cinnamon and care. One morning it wasn't there, just an empty plate, steamless. And though she still cooked, still washed, still folded his mother's shawl each night, She no longer waited to see if he liked the meals. She no longer waited for anything. And that absence, that quiet withdrawing, gnawed at him in ways calluses and hard winters never had. One afternoon, as he mended a bridle out by the barn, he found a stitch already started in the worn leather. Tiny, neat, done by a hand that cared. He touched it, then pulled the thread out only to sew it again himself. That evening, Edith found the saddle whole and the thread still warm. She didn't smile. But she did set a peach cobbler on the table beside it with no name and no note. And for the first time in days, Reuben ate every bite. His mother, Mrs. Maddox, noticed the quiet shift before either of them did. "She's still here," she rasped one evening, sipping her broth. "And you're still walking around like your boots are filled with guilt." "I didn't ask her to stay," he muttered. "No, but you haven't asked her to go either." He didn't answer. The old woman set her bowl down with a soft clink. "She keeps this house from turning to dust. And you, boy, you act like she's the ghost when it's been you haunting these walls all along." Later that week, Lana, the ranch hand's daughter, brought Edith a small bouquet of prairie lilies. "Mama says these only grow after storms," she said shyly. Edith tucked them in a jar near the sink. The petals leaned toward the light, and something in her heart did too. That Sunday, Edith wore the pale blue dress she'd mended months ago, but never dared wear. It wasn't fancy, just cotton with tiny buttons and a waist that cinched like memory. She walked to church beside Mrs. Maddox's chair, her hands steady on the wheels, her back straight head high. People whispered, "They say she lives in that house, with no ring. With that man, she looks too proud for someone without a name." But Reuben saw her from the back pew, noticed how her hands calmed his mother's trembling, how the light from the stained glass played along the silver in her hair, how his chest tightened with something he dared not name. After the service, he approached. "You look different today," he said. She raised a brow. "It's still me." He nodded, eyes low. "I know. I think I'm only seeing now." That night, he left no coins on the table, just a wildflower pressed between 2 pages of scripture and placed gently beside her apron, and a note. 5 words scrawled in the same clumsy hand he used to write catalogs. "Thank you for not leaving." Edith read it once, then again. Her fingers traced the crease of the page like it might vanish if she blinked. She didn't cry, but when she poured his tea that night, quiet, warm, steady, she added just a touch more honey than usual. And he noticed. Outside, the prairie wind calmed. Chickens roosted early. The house no longer felt like it was waiting for something. It had become a thing in motion again, like hearts that had once stalled now beating on slow but true. Sometimes the first kindness we accept is the one we never dared ask for. The rain came slow that week, the kind that didn't shout or crackle, just whispered across the roof like a memory returning. It made the house feel smaller somehow, softer, like even the walls were listening. In the dim kitchen, Edith peeled apples beside the wood stove, her hands sure and silent. Outside, Reuben split logs with the precision of a man who needed the rhythm more than the fire. He hadn't spoken much since the note, but he lingered near her more, hovered at thresholds, watched the way she folded cloth, smoothed his mother's hair, whispered lullabies to the wind when she thought no one heard. And each night she'd find something left for her, not flowers, not words, just small offerings, an oiled hinge, a fixed shutter, an empty bucket refilled. Until one night Mrs. Maddox spoke what had been gathering like thunderclouds for weeks. "You two dance around the truth like it'll burn you." Edith, startled, looked up from her sewing. "Ma'am," the old woman turned her head slowly. "You think I don't see it, him watching you like a man afraid to believe? And you walking through this house like you don't already belong to it." "I don't," Edith said softly. "I'm just here to cook, to help." "You're here to live," Mrs. Maddox said. "Ain't no shame in that." Later that evening, the wind picked up. Reuben stood outside the barn, eyes on the clouds. Edith came to him, lantern in hand. "You all right?" she asked. He didn't turn. "There's something you ought to know." She waited patient. "My wife. She didn't die like folks said." His voice was rougher than the wind. "She left, took my boy, never came back." A silence fell between them, long and kind. "I was angry for years," he said. "Thought it made me strong, but I just stopped being a person." He looked at her now. Really looked. You walked into this house and it started breathing again. Edith's eyes didn't fill. They softened. I've been left too, she said. Not by death, by love that gave up. She reached for the lantern and set it between them. Its glow danced on his face, making him look younger somehow. Or maybe just unguarded. We don't have to name it, she said gently. We just have to not run from it. He nodded once. That was all he could give. And it was enough. That night, Mrs. Maddox called Edith to her room. You love him, the old woman asked bluntly. I don't know yet, Edith replied. But I care more than I should. Then love will come easy. She reached for Edith's hand, her fingers cool as linen. Promise me something. Yes, ma'am, if I go, don't let him bury himself again. Edith's throat tightened. She nodded. In the dark, Reuben sat at the kitchen table, her teacup placed beside his. 2 cups, 1 silence. But somehow everything was starting to be said. Some truths don't break us. They open us like windows in a long shuttered room. The wind shifted that week, carried whispers in its folds. From the general store to the church porch and all the way down to the ranch gate, everyone had something to say about Edith Fay, the widow woman who cooked without a ring on her finger and wore her dignity like an apron. She's too comfortable in that house, murmured Miss Haverly. She wears grief like a badge, scoffed Mrs. Talbot. Waltzes around like she ain't just a hired woman, another spat. And always the unspoken tale to every sentence. What does he see in her? Edith bore it quietly. She always had. She kept her hands busy kneading dough, tending the garden, combing Mrs. Maddox's thinning hair with a tenderness that made the old woman weep in her sleep. But silence doesn't mean surrender. And on a Tuesday morning when Edith stepped into the chapel with a loaf of honey bread for the church pantry, a voice rang out sharper than frost. Well, well, if it isn't the woman who cooked her way into a rancher's bedroom. Edith turned slowly. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch. But her words held the weight of a woman who'd survived too much to let shame stick. I cooked for a dying woman, she said, and kept a house most of you were too proud to step into. If that earns me your scorn, I'll wear it like perfume. She placed the bread on the table gently like a benediction, then walked out. Back at the ranch, Reuben stood waiting. Word traveled fast in small towns. I heard. She wiped flour from her hands. I suppose you did. He stepped closer. You didn't deserve it. I've weathered worse, she whispered then, after a breath. But hearing you say that helps. His jaw worked like a man unused to tenderness. Then he reached forward, calloused fingers brushing the side of her wrist. I should have said more sooner. You didn't have to, she said softly. You stayed. That's louder than words. That night a storm rolled in. Mrs. Maddox took to coughing, and Edith sat beside her bed for hours wiping her brow, singing soft songs half remembered from childhood. Reuben hovered in the hall helpless, then finally stepped inside. He pulled up a chair and took his mother's other hand. Together they stayed through the thunder. When dawn broke, Cora Maddox whispered, You'll be all right, the two of you. And then like a flame easing to smoke, she was gone. The funeral was quiet, just townsfolk in stiff black and a few lingering glances toward Edith, whose hand Reuben never once let go of. No one whispered that day, because sometimes even small towns know when to hush. Loss doesn't always take love with it. Sometimes it leaves space for it to finally bloom. The ranch felt different now, quieter somehow. Not with grief, but with the soft, sacred hush of something honored. Mrs. Maddox's rocker remained on the porch. Edith never moved it. Instead, she placed a quilt over the back one she'd sewn in the late hours of watching over the old woman. Every morning she'd pass it, touch the wood and nod. Not in mourning, in memory. Reuben had changed too. He wasn't softer, not exactly, but his silences were no longer sharp, his footsteps slower, more certain. He noticed things now like how Edith hummed when folding linens, how she kept a sprig of rosemary by the stove to remember what endures. And one morning after coffee, he said, I bought new seed for the upper field. Was thinking we could plant together this season. Edith looked up. We, she echoed. He swallowed hard. If you'd stay, not just to cook or to mend, but to be here. Later that week, Edith found a small wooden box tucked behind the flour sack. Inside a simple silver ring and a slip of paper torn from a ledger. On it, just 6 words written in a strong, hesitant hand. Not for service. For love. R. She didn't cry. Not then. She pressed the note to her chest, eyes closed, breathing in the scent of yeast and cedarwood. Then she tucked it back into the box, slid the ring on, and returned to her bread. She knew what came next wasn't a grand wedding or a crowd of applauding townsfolk. It would be supper on a quiet porch, a child's laughter in the hayloft, 2 hands passing tools without needing words. That kind of love didn't shout. It stayed. That evening, they sat on the porch together, Reuben, Edith, and Lainey, who leaned her head against Edith's side, already half asleep. The sky blushed pink over the plains. A hawk soared high above a silent arc of grace. Reuben reached for Edith's hand, this time not just to hold, but to keep. Some women aren't rescued, they rebuild. Some men don't chase love, they learn to be worthy of it. Would you like to hear what happens next? Or hear stories like this again? If you've felt something stir in your heart tonight, subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. We believe the quietest stories often hold the deepest truths. Leave a comment if you choose love like this over fireworks. Subscribe if you believe the best love stories begin late but last forever. Share this story with someone who's still waiting for their quiet, steady kind of love. In the end, love didn't come galloping in with grand gestures or wild declarations. It came slowly in the way Edith stirred the soup without needing to be asked. In the way Reuben watched her from the porch, as if trying to remember how to believe in something again. And maybe that's what healing really looks like. Not a miracle, but a quiet choice made day after day in the face of everything that once said you weren't worthy of kindness. This story reminds us you are not too old, you are not too broken, and it is never too late to be chosen not for what you do, but for who you are when you think no one's watching. Thank you for traveling with us down this dusty trail of hearts mended and doors left open. If this story touched something quiet in you, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel, None on Wild West Saga. Every week we bring you true-hearted tales from the frontier where hope rides slow but steady. And tell us in the comments, would you like to see what happens next in Edith and Reuben's journey, or hear another story of late love and quiet redemption? We're listening, and we're grateful you're here.